Good afternoon. Thank you and welcome to our discussion. Tonight we'll be hearing from three individuals on the topic of identity, campus, and change. Immediately to my right is Hugh Price. Hugh is from the Amherst class of 1963 and experienced Amherst in the late 50s and early 1960s as one of 5 black students in his class. His recent memoir, This African American Life, chronicles his childhood in segregated Washington, D.C., his time at Amherst, the civil rights and anti-poverty movements of the 1960s, and his professional life, which includes serving as president and CEO of the National Urban League from 1994 to 2003. On my far right is Norm Jones, who is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Amherst, where he works to provide strategic leadership on diversity and inclusion by supporting curricular content and pedagogy around issues of inclusion and diversity, improving faculty and staff recruitment, development and retention programs, creating a culture of assessment and evaluation of diversity and inclusion initiatives, and partnering across all divisions of the college. And second to my right is Professor Elizabeth Aries, who is the Clarence Francis 1910 Professor of Social Sciences in Psychology and has taught at Amherst since 1975. She has researched gender and communication and more recently race and social class. In the spring semester 2016, she began teaching a new course titled Intergroup Dialogue on Race, which brings together students to examine the roles race and other intersecting identities play in their lives. And she and I have co-taught that course together on 2 occasions. I'm going to moderate a conversation with our guests and will be sure to leave time for Q&A with the audience at the end. Institutions, students, core values evolve over time. Hugh, can you start us off by talking about Amherst when you were a student?
I entered Amherst roughly 59 years ago, give or take a few months. And when I arrived at Amherst, it was a smaller school, only about 1,000 students, 250 in our class. And as you mentioned, there were 5 African Americans in my class. 3 of us got through the first year. And we were sort of the high watermark in those years in terms of Amherst. The school was deeply committed to freedom of expression, intellectual rigor. We had a truly terrifying set of freshman courses. We each had to take English composition, European history, foreign language, physics, calculus, and one other that I've repressed. And that was regardless of what your academic preparation was, regardless of whether you'd only had algebra, you had to take calculus. The thing that was most surprising to me when I got here was that Amherst tolerated fraternities as segregated against blacks. I knew that fraternity life dominated the college socially, but nothing in the fine print prepared me for the fact that most of the fraternities did not admit black students. And so that was the cold shower for me when I got here. In every other respect, Amherst lived up to my expectations academically. I will never forget my first day at James Hall when I got up to my floor, the 4th floor, and I walked past an open door and there was a Confederate flag and a deep Southern accent. And I said, even though I grew up in Washington below the Mason-Dixon line, I wasn't that far below the Mason-Dixon line, and that was going to be my first encounter with someone from the Deep South. And I said, well, this will be a growth experience for all of us. But we got along. So I grew tremendously. I think the fascinating thing in reflection is that there were some unexamined givens about Amherst and its values which they did not examine closely and which needed to be examined at the time. And, of course, the college evolved.
Wonderful. Thank you. Buffy, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, I would add just a little bit to that. I wasn't there back in the 50s. However, I've been studying the class of 2009, and one of the graduates from the class of 1959, 50 years earlier than the class that I have studied, pointed out to me that each reunion class puts together a 50th reunion booklet that's in the archives for those of us who just came from the wonderful archives here. And what was unusual, so usually the people that attend a reunion are probably people who even don't attend, write reminiscences about their lives and some about Amherst. And the person who edited that particular volume asked the 2 black students from that class, there were a total of 4, if they would write an essay about their experience as black students at Amherst College. He also asked one of the 15 Jewish students to write something about what it was like to be Jewish in those years. So these were quite fascinating essays that gave me a window into Amherst 50 years before the Amherst that I was studying. And the two black students who wrote this essay came from Washington, D.C. We recruited, I think maybe if you would know this, from Dunbar High School, which is I think where we had
Harold
Pipeline.
Hazlett and Buddy Hayes.
This was, Ray Hayes and Larry Burwell, I think his name was.
I know.
And I mean, that's where we recruited many of our black students. So they were excited about, this was a segregated high school in D.C. They were very excited about the opportunity that Amherst was going to afford them. They requested roommates. They were not given roommates. They were given singles and in different dormitories. This was part of how Amherst handled things in those years. We did the same thing with women. We split them up in different dormitories rather than putting them together where they might have other people to check in with at the end of the day. They found, obviously, the atmosphere here unfamiliar, but they also described it as unforgiving and impersonal. There was not a single black faculty member. There was not a single black administrator. There was no support for them in terms of making a transition and helping them be included. They basically said that, and as Hugh said, there were 5 people in his class, there were 4 in this class, most of them didn't make it through. A lot of them left after a year, some after a semester, so that they described the other 2 black members of their class as very promising, went on to do great things, but they couldn't make it here. But I think what happened was that Amherst saw that more as their failure than the college's failure at that point in time. I mean, Amherst really did nothing to help them with the transition. They also spoke, and Hugh's spoken about this a little, about being outsiders to social life, which was organized around fraternities, and in addition, given the admissions policies at Smith and Mount Holyoke, there were almost no black women in the Valley. So that made things even more difficult in terms of being outsiders to social life. So I think, whenever people say we've got problems today, if you go back to this as a comparison, we've come a long way over the years in terms of the supports and understanding of the issues and institutional changes, and I guess we're going to get to this later when we talk about, but it was a very interesting window for me into what Amherst was like.
Could I just add a coda?
Yes, please do.
During my freshman year, my future wife, who attended Mount Holyoke, was the only African-American student on campus that entire year. We got word over here in Amherst that there was a golden harvest of beautiful black co-eds at Wellesley. And in that spring, I was the member of my class who had enough money to hitchhike to Wellesley. I literally hitchhiked to Wellesley, and I met a number of the black women there, and I came back and said, there's gold in the hills of Wellesley. That's the way it was back then. I had no reason to expect it to be much different. I would say that I was furious with the college over allowing segregated fraternities. If anybody's ever seen the movie Animal House, that happened to me during recruitment week in the fraternities. I was shown the furnace room and the porch. I was not shown the social areas of a couple of the fraternities. So that's the way it was. And you came to the college not expecting a lot more, but being disappointed that it wasn't more hospitable.
As a transition, Norm, I wondered if you would, maybe it's a leap to go from there to the expectations of students of today. And for me, that's sort of a segue from Hugh's most recent remarks. Would you like to comment about that?
It's interesting. I think many students are much less interested, I would say, in these historical narratives that have been concretized over decades and centuries as a way to articulate the value proposition of an elite education, and much more interested, I would say, in helping the institution think about the way it's transformed by virtue of their presence in the community. And so that's a very different way of talking about what it means to bring your distinctiveness into a space. A lot of times it is tied to social identities, but it's also tied to academic contributions, right? The way the discourse gets moved and expanded by virtue of bringing a very different lived experience into the classroom and the way that spills outside of the classroom. So I think that's an interesting evolution to trace over the last, decades.
I was part of the last generation, I think, of relatively quiescent students when it came to social issues. Certainly the first 3 years on campus, there was some agitation around the fraternities, but not a whole lot. There were no boycotts. There was no takeover of the president's office or a takeover of any fraternity to try to force change. There was a lot of anger among people who were disenchanted with the fraternities, and many of them dropped out of fraternities and became independents. And then socially, you were consigned to the meeting rooms down in the basement of the dorms for your social life. But to the extent there was engagement and activity, it was more outer directed. So the tail end of my stretch here, the freedom rides and the sit-ins had begun in the South. And I think many students up north, including me and a number of my class, were feeling guilty that our energies weren't focused on the big justice issues elsewhere in the country as opposed to the lesser issues on campus. And so we were very proud of the fact in the spring of my senior year, a lot of kids from the Northeast took buses down to Washington. We actually picketed in front of the White House, boom. And then a couple of months after I graduated, I served as a marshal in the March on Washington in 1963. So our energy was outer directed once it was awakened, but it was a relatively quiescent. There were a couple of students who were agitating, but it was largely outer directed. There were some evils of the fraternity system, including the way the rushing process occurred and how it guaranteed admission to every student who wanted to join a fraternity, but that didn't mean you got into the fraternity of your choice, and invariably at the 11th hour on rushing night, there'd be a few students left who had not been chosen for a fraternity, and the big fraternities and the small fraternities, the segregated fraternities and the integrated fraternities would do a stare down over who was going to admit the quote-unquote, as they were labeled, the turkeys in the class who did not have a bid at that point. And I became, when I was exposed to that as rushing chairman for our fraternity, I was really embittered about fraternities and wanted nothing more to do with them. But again, that didn't stir any big uprising on campus because the energy was more outer directed, what was going on in the heart of the civil rights movement in the South.
Yes, I see a question from the audience.
So this is complementary to what you're saying. After the Amherst uprising in November 2015, the listservs came alive. And a couple of weeks after the uprising, Lowell Henry, a black member of the class of 1962, made really a dramatic entry. He said, "Hello, I'm here." And he told the story of the two members of the class of 1962 who were black, and he talked about maybe was it 5?
Fred Wallace and
in the class of 1963. And he told about their experience. And I think what he said is that our experience isn't so different from the experience that is being bemoaned in the library. It's that there weren't very many of us who were going to, we were only a few. We weren't going to speak up. But if we're 100, we will speak up. So I guess, so it's really the issue of to what extent the difficulties, that were experienced 50 years ago remain the difficulties that they're experienced now. And obviously it's not identical, but it was really very powerful.
But I would say some of the difficulties being experienced are the same over all these years. And there have been moments where I think change happened because black students stood up in the 90s. There was a meeting held at the Drew House where black students talked about the fact that, many of them come in with expectations and dreams about becoming a doctor, and then we had introductory courses that kind of
Flushed them out.
Flushed them out. When I came here in '75, I think there was a very different set of expectations by faculty about what their obligations to our students were. I think when I came here, you basically had a one-size-fits-all class, in these introductory gateway courses, be it in math, econ, chemistry, whatever. You taught the course at 6-week marking period. You sent in a lot of D's and F's. Those people were, there was no obligation that everyone could learn chemistry or everyone could learn math. There's been dramatic change over time. It didn't happen immediately. I mean, but I do remember 10 years after that uprising with the Black Student Union in '74, 10 years later they brought back the black students from the BSU to see what had happened. Change had already begun to happen, you know, but it takes 10 years, so they're out of here in 4 years. They don't always see it. But I think there's a very different sense being a faculty member at Amherst now, that these are the students we accept. You have an obligation to make this work for them. And I mean, with the Teaching and Learning Center, really in the last, I'd say 10 or 15 years, Amherst is made a real effort to enable faculty to learn new pedagogies, more inclusive pedagogies. The writing center that we put in place, which used to be staffed by one professional and who taught students, is staffed by professionals who also work with faculty members. I've attended many workshops learning how to be a better critic of students' work, what's a helpful comment, what's not. We get no training as that, you know, in that as faculty members, how to write better assignments. A lot of times, if students do poorly on assignment, we're writing an unclear assignment. I mean, no, seriously, like, I mean, you know, we blame everything on the students. They're not up to the rigors of this curriculum. But I think Amherst has taken much more seriously now, and faculty have, that we accept a diverse student body. We have to change our policies and practices and our pedagogies if we want to make this work and actually enable all these students who are accepting to succeed, or at least give it our best shot. That was not the attitude when I got here.
I remember talking with a fellow when I was head of the Urban League who had just finished his freshman year at Amherst, and I admired him. He sort of walked into my office and sat down and said he wanted to chat. No appointment. His name was Travis Bristol, and I asked him how it first year had gone, and he said it really kicked his behind, especially English. And so I said, well, you got into Amherst, you must have had a really strong academic record. He had gone to one of the regular high schools in New York. I said, well, what kinds of courses did you take? Did you take AP courses? He said, I took them in English, took them in history. So what kind of writing did you do? He said, all we did was write 500-word essays to get over on the test. I wasn't prepared to write an English paper, let alone 3 a week. I wasn't prepared to write a term paper. Nobody in high school taught me, and nobody at Amherst did what you did, which is we're going to make sure you're successful. Travis has gone on to become one of the luminaries in education reform with a PhD from either Stanford or Columbia Teachers College, and he's a big star. So I think the point you make about the transition in the philosophy of the faculty, that it's when you identify talent and potential and you admit young people who've got that talent and potential, you have to invest in their success rather than just welcome them to campus and wish them Godspeed.
And it is probably in the last 10 years that the faculty mandated the first-year seminar program to teach writing, because people come in with uneven preparation. And I've talked to a lot of students who haven't written more than a book report in high school, or a 500-word essay, or never even read a whole book in the course of a year in their high schools. So that if you don't level the playing field, and the math department, we've got David Cox here, I want to shout out to the math department because they've done an amazing job working really hard to find ways to help their students succeed, and the number of math majors has skyrocketed as a consequence. So it used to be, oh, you know, people can't do math. Wrong. People can do math. It takes a lot of effort to make this work, but it's working.
And Norma, I wanted to ask you, your work as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer in many ways strikes me, the division that you've created in the 2 years since you've been here really speaks to this kind of institutional change. So I wondered if you would comment on that.
Yeah, as I was listening to Buffy speak and Hugh as well, I was thinking about the fact that it is so easy for us to forget the origins of higher education, right? That the academy was established as kind of a mecca of exclusive excellence, not inclusive excellence. So there's a way in which structures have had to catch up to demography, right? It isn't just enough to amass compositional diversity, but the institution has to actually ask itself what else has to change in the environment so that the people that you've invited into a space can actually be successful. And that is not about preparation only. That's actually about the ability to evolve, right, and adapt to who's in the community. And I think that's one of the values of diversity work, is to help people make those important distinctions between diversity and inclusion, right? They are not the same thing. One begets the other. And I actually appreciate partners who think about inclusive practices before they think about compositional diversity, because whether or not someone is in your space who's different than you or not, if you can find the agency to kind of change the environment and prepare the environment such that everyone is successful, irrespective of a variety of variables, you're going to be more successful. And that's why in many ways corporate America and the private sector have kind of surpassed higher ed in some ways, because they understand the bottom line. So there's a real accountability to sort of making some of these harder decisions. In education, the bottom line is the production of knowledge. So the question becomes, how do we appreciate the people that we've invited into the space such that they are able to co-produce knowledge with us and therefore bring more value to the institution? So that's really the core of the work as far as I'm concerned.
Ironically, probably the pace car in understanding and making diversity and inclusion work is the U.S. military, which has more generals per minority generals, et cetera, and their view simply is you can't have a modern military drawn from this increasingly diverse society without having an officer corps that can lead them. And so they've got some remarkable practices in that regard. It's not nirvana, but
We touched upon student activism, the role of student activism in change, in producing the change, the question from the audience. And for me, one part that we touched upon was maybe this notion of critical mass and how Amherst has changed in that regard, to counting in the 50s and 60s on one hand, with a few fingers left over, how many black students were on campus, to where we are today. And so I wonder about that role of critical mass of students in particular, and how that has affected change across the college.
well, I think critical mass is hugely important, but so is this environment that surrounds the college. I mean, we are in a vastly more activist engaged era than I mentioned. My generation, particularly north of the Mason-Dixon line, was pretty quiescent. The South, the students in the South who were involved in the freedom rides and sit-ins, it flipped a switch and they were very involved. But there's certainly matters that you've got critical mass, not just among students who are agitated about conditions, but also among students who may not technically be agitated because they're not affected directly, approximately, but who understand the justice involved. I think the key thing is that student bodies play a critical role in helping an institution continuously examine its core values and live up to them, and make sure that they don't take core values for granted that are outdated. I mean, fraternity life when I was here was a given. And I mean, to this day, when I wrote some reflections for my 50th anniversary, several of my classmates, and I was quite critical of Amherst about the fact that it tolerated segregated fraternities. A number of my classmates at that reunion said, was it really like that? 50 years later, it just was not part of their gestalt. So students played a critically important role, both affected and sort of slightly less proximate, in making a school, encouraging a school to live up to the values that they profess, and that you know, it's values of diversity and inclusion, but also everything else that the institution stands for: freedom of expression, intellectual rigor, etc. That's all on the table, and it all evolves over time. What we mean by those terms must evolve over time, and students are part of the community that helps hold schools to account, as are faculty, obviously.
This is just one interesting anecdote that comes to mind as you're talking about the fraternities. I gave a talk when the class of 59 came for their 50th reunion, and two men came up to me afterwards, and I'm sorry I don't remember their name, and they were in fraternities that went co-ed and took white students, and they got letters from, I guess what used to happen is if men would come up from some of the other colleges to meet women, and they would stay, if you belonged to a fraternity, you could stay over at anybody's kind of fraternity house that was a member of that fraternity. And they got letters saying, I can't stay in your house anymore because you accepted Tom, whoever, this white student. And because that's what happened. People would come to this area and, to meet women at Smith or meet women at Holyoke, and they would stay in the Amherst fraternity houses, stay over. You can do that if you go some other school. And they were great. These men wrote back and said, well, I'm sorry, because Tom is a wonderful person, and he's a member of this fraternity. So if you can't stay here, you can't stay here. So there was pushback. I mean, there were people who were trying to change things at Amherst, and fraternities that did they ultimately had to, whatever it is, you quit your national organization and just become an independent. Yeah, you get thrown. Well, you do, because you've just violated the rules. So change is slow, partly numbers, it's partly there is pushback to keep things in place. And this one handful of students, that changed in the late 60s with the civil rights movement. It went from a handful to probably 25, 28, I don't know, you were class of 82?
82, yes.
How many were in your class?
In my first year class, probably 25.
25, right. So
yeah.
in the late 60s, it jumped up. And then the real push for racial diversity, I would say, came after 2000. When I began 2005, 1/3 of our students were students of color. By today, it's closer to half. So the real push on, in terms of completely changing the student body, I'd say has been in the last 15 years, both in terms of class diversity and race diversity.
The other thing that critical mass does, I think, is that it forces us to think more intentionally about differences in group. When you have one or two fill in the blank, I think we tend to see those individuals as unidimensional because whatever difference they represent we don't benefit from detailed accounts of who those individuals are per se. When you have critical mass, you have to actually appreciate the fact that, not all, again, fill in the blank, are created equal per se or having the same experience or are concerned about the same things. So I think we see that certainly in our student body, but we're really seeing it in the community writ large, that we can actually trace the ways in which policies have evolved, practices have evolved, environments have had to be shaped differently because we have to accommodate more needs. And I think the more we point to those differences in group, the more we can actually celebrate what true diversity is about, which goes well beyond the numbers and gets more at the core of the difference across lived experiences.
It's about critical mass, but it's also about a collective awakening. As I was coming up here, I saw a student walking around with an Amherst Mammoth T-shirt on, and oh yeah, I remember that. And I think back to when I was here, we knew that Lord Jeff had sold blankets infected with smallpox, but we didn't question. We just knew that was an embarrassing part of Amherst history, and we overlooked it, and okay, it's Lord Jeff, fine, let's move on. But what happened here a few years ago said, no, that's not fine. And that wasn't just a critical mass, that was a collective calling to account for the
And
school.
it's also national.
Yeah, absolutely.
The push is not just, when we had that uprising, there were uprisings
Yeah.
across the country on college campuses. So everything is so much more interconnected now to, what's going on outside. I mean, in fact, the uprising we had was because students wanted to have an event in sympathy with students at other colleges.
Well, a good friend of mine is the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and I taught there, and the uprising against Woodrow Wilson occurred on her first year as dean. She's African-American, and I'm sure she'd thank you very much. I really needed this in my first year.
Thank you. So this really touches upon how students navigate and negotiate a particular campus, how they did it in the 50s and 60s, and how they're doing it today. So I wonder if we could speak to the process, what we're hearing from students on the ground about still navigating and what it takes to make your way through Amherst College in 2018 with this awakened awareness, new level of student activism, and a much more greater appreciation for the multiple identities that people bring to campus.
I think one of the things students are looking for is a greater acknowledgement about what's going on in the culture beyond the institution. There's something, I guess, somewhat ironic about liberal arts education that sometimes unconsciously suggests that there's something so special, so particular about this 4-year experience that students are sort of disconnected from the world around them in terms of the discourse. And I think, the value of the lived experience on a residential campus often is about the ability to participate in the world around you and make sense of that world in the context of the classes you're taking, the kind of service you're able to engage in, the dialogue across differences, the dialogue within a group. And it's, I think what I find unfortunate in our current climate, meaning the larger culture, is that our conversations are so politically fraught that we tend to shy away from engaging hard conversations about what's going on in the world around us. And yet we know that, this space, just like any other space, is a microcosm of that world, right? So it's a real opportunity, actually, to kind of interrogate lack of progress in our systems, lack of progress in communities. And, what better way to do that but in the context of the learning environment. But I think it's a real struggle, and it even represents at times kind of a risk, right, to enter into those kinds of conversations, both inside and outside of the classroom. And that's why we often see students who are looking for opportunities to take the bus trip, to figure out what it would mean to lobby legislators, what it would mean to raise money for a particular cause right here on campus that might not be confined to the campus, but is actually responding to what's going on in the world. It's a form of engagement that I think is really important for us to kind of lean into a little bit more.
I was thinking, Alan and I have taught this intergroup dialogue course, and in the middle of the course, when you get to the 8th week, that students pick the topics that we're going to dialogue about. And the ones that, it has to be some controversial issue that they care about. So this year, the ones they picked were free speech, which was really an interesting conversation. The second one was affirmative action, and the third one was kind of, can you be friends with someone who voted for Trump? Friends or family, because people had in the class parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles who voted for Trump. That was their favorite one. We were a little, whoa. This is and there were very differing opinions, and very different opinions by race. Can you be friends with a Trump voter? We had, I think, 4 or 5 black students. Absolutely not. Every one of them, no. But they could see that there were white students, because first of all, they had no relatives that voted for Trump, so they didn't have that conflict. Whereas for some of the white students, this is, are you going to cut off your father, your, whatever. And then there was an Asian student who was from a wealthy family whose father voted for Trump, and she said, well, isn't it different if you're just a Trump supporter? He didn't really support Trump fully, but he voted for him because he was really for his economic policies that were going to benefit the father. And a black student said, no, I can make no distinction. I can't make a distinction because Trump is a package. He's racist. He will basically do nothing that will enable me to be a full citizen in this society. And but at that point, we have norms for, we're not here to change anyone's mind. We're here to understand why someone thinks what they think. And, not to change it, just to really understand it and how someone else's thinking might have an impact on you. So to the Asian student, no, I can't accept your father's move because here's the implications for me. It was a fabulous, I thought, Alan, you probably step out of your role and say something, but some of these the one on free speech was equally fascinating in terms of whether it should be protected.
And it did that course allowed us to get beyond that surface level of having a theoretical academic conversation about free speech, political differences. And now with the students saying, I'm going home next week for Thanksgiving, and at the table, Uncle Joe is going to say this, and and so we really had the conversation, and it both revealed the differences within the classroom, but it also brought people together in a way to problem solve about how to
handle it.
deal with a family member that you're going to have to deal with. Because for many, it was disengaged. No, that's a deal breaker, end of conversation. But there were students who said, no, it's my father. That's not an option. So how do I negotiate that? And so to be able to do that in an academic space here, I think was one of the rare opportunities where we could get beyond just what's in the reading and actually talk with each other at a human level about your experience on this campus and in your family.
Yeah, I think that's also an opportunity to open up the conversation a bit. I mean, I am a lapsed lawyer and former editorial writer, and I used to appear on Fox a lot, not because I was a fan of Fox, but because I wasn't a fan of Fox. And I think there's another level of discussion and examination, which is why did folks vote for Trump? And what can you learn from learning and examining and studying why people voted for him, and how much of it was about him, how much of it was about their circumstances, what aspects of their views might be malleable. You've got an election coming. Are there arguments that can perhaps change their view, particularly as things evolve under Trump? I found when I was an editorial writer for the New York Times, there were a couple of particularly one arch conservative, very famous conservative who was on the board. We actually got along well and played a lot of tennis together, but we didn't see the world the same way. He persuaded me of some things that I disagreed with him about, the more I learned from him. And I persuaded him of some things, and then there were some big zones where we just did not agree at all. When I was the head of the National Urban League, we had many encounters with police chiefs and prosecutors over police practice, and we had to lean on President Clinton to get him to pay attention to these issues because he was trying to spit the bit on it. But we finally had a meeting with the Attorney General Reno, and one of the issues we wanted to talk about in that meeting was why is it that when police come upon a driver, they always have their hand on the butt of the pistol? An intimidating act, it's terrifying to a driver. So we confronted the police chiefs in the meeting about that. They said, do you happen to realize that that is the single most dangerous encounter for a police officer? They don't know what they're walking up on. While we're in those meetings in Washington discussing that issue, a famous black nationalist by the name of H. Rap Brown was stopped by the police, and when the policeman walked up on him, Rap Brown pulled a gun and shot him. So we had to say, oh, we get it now. We get it now. The point of which is, I think for purposes of just sharing the space with other human beings, it's important to understand their views. I've spent a lot of time trying to read many books. Recently read Janesville. I've read several books on why it was that Trump's message appealed to people, just to see whether there's any way to get to them. And this, by the way, is not an American phenomenon. People all over Europe are rejecting liberalism because they feel that sort of progressives ignored their economic plight, just as progressives here, because things ain't working out if you live in Janesville. Just as they're not working out if you live in Holyoke or Greenfield or Pittsfield or smaller towns, North Adams, it's not working out very well. So to appeal to the body politic, you have to understand that. Those are the economic issues and social issues, and then there's the question of Trump, but you got to separate what it is about him that you like as opposed to what is about your circumstances that you feel you've been abandoned by. And I think that anybody engaged has got to examine that. Plus, in the process, we might learn something. And lastly, the lawyer in me learned that the best way to engage in advocacy is to climb inside the head and life experience of your opponent, play that role, understand the arguments, and then you're in a better position to rebut them if you ever have to engage. So those are the reasons why I think the academic environment is ideally suited for that kind of deep intellectual understanding of difference, political difference, social, emotional difference, etc. And those are great opportunities for really rigorous examination of the hard questions that we face as our society. And depending, regardless of your political views, whether you're on one side or the other, if you're going to prevail in elections with the body politic, you've got to understand the arts of persuasion and what it is that moves people. Which isn't to say there aren't certain things about him or certain things about others who are running for political office that are going to be appealing.
I think that's an excellent segue to the last set of questions I'd like to ask, and that's about Amherst's role in our students, what we want for them, and their futures at Amherst and beyond. And what are some of the things that we, at a small liberal arts college tucked up in the northwest corner of Massachusetts, wish for our students, and how we might better prepare them for life beyond Amherst?
Well, I would say they're going out into a multicultural world. I just followed up last summer on the students in my 2009 study. They're age 30 now. And I asked them about what's the racial composition of your neighborhoods. And half of them are living in gentrifying neighborhoods. They're racially diverse neighborhoods. And I asked them about their workspaces and whether they needed skills at working with people of different races and cultures, and the majority of them said yes to that question. They are definitely, I asked them about their friendship networks and the percent of their friends who were white versus other races. Their networks include a lot of people of other races. So they are definitely moving into a multicultural world. I asked them about how much thought they give to race and racism in their daily lives. And the world has changed since they left Amherst College. And with the Black Lives Matter movement and all that's in the press and on their evening news about police brutality, they think about it. This is something they are thinking about. I don't know when they came into Amherst that they, a lot of them, when I saw them as freshmen in 2005, a lot of the white students were utterly unaware of their race. I mean, some of them had just never thought about race. When I asked them, do they think they had any advantages because of their race, the majority of them said no, or they said, well, maybe I have, but I can't think of what they are. So they were unaware of white privilege. I mean, this is something they learned through, in the course of their years at Amherst. So ultimately, they're going to need skills. I mean, we're going to have to, personally, I feel, do more because this group split in half. The ones who engage with diversity, here's one other question. I'm sorry, this is a little inarticulate, but I was thinking, one other question I asked them is, what do you want to tell your children about race? How do you want to socialize them? What do you want them to know? And at age 30, none of the white students had children yet. Some of them, actually, I was surprised at the number who weren't even sure if they're going to have children. But I said, even if you're not having children, what would you want them to know? And the interesting thing is that there were a lot of people who said, they wanted them to understand racial stereotypes, that you can't judge people based on those stereotypes and that, their cultural differences. Very few, though, wanted to say to their children, you're growing up in a racist society where there is institutional, at that level, not just their individual prejudice and discrimination. There are racist, institutions, there's structural racism, there, laws that are racist, and you're going to grow up in this society, and maybe you have some obligation or responsibility to think about that and what you might do to address it. This isn't the message that white people are giving their children. And so in terms of change, it's like, I don't know that we've left them. I'll tell you something else. 85% of them voted in the presidential election and 75% in local elections. So we are producing people who are civically, that's so beyond the national, this is every group, black, low income, whatever it was. They're voting. They are active. So I think that's great. But in terms of commitment to social justice, and maybe that's not part of our mission, it's not there in the data that they're, some of them are. And it's the people who engaged most with diversity while they were here are the ones who, and took courses. You can learn about, my friend had racist experiences in life from forming relationships with someone of another race, but you don't learn about the structural level unless you really take courses in sociology and black studies. So that you learn, they learned a lot about difference, but they didn't learn about the next level up. And in terms of wanting to ever work for social change, I think you have to learn more.
I think about two specific things. One is, I think Amherst students across, sort of every kind of identifying category have this remarkable ability to understand how to enact change in a variety of systems, whether that comes through navigating an internship, navigating a classroom dynamic, navigating a residential situation. Our students are very savvy when it comes to understanding how a thing works, which means that they have much higher competency levels when it comes to kind of moving change forward as leaders. And so I'm excited about that. The other thing that I really want for our students is to lean more intentionally into being vocal about positive self-concept. I get so disappointed and irritated by these hyper narratives out in the world that are so clearly deficit-based around opportunities for success, chances of success, preparation gaps. Are these things real? Yes, in many ways they are. Are they the fault of individuals? Absolutely not, right? Systemic oppression is still a very real thing. And so I wish we could sort of formalize the ability to teach students about stereotype threat and kind of putting their brilliance alongside these narratives such as you just take the wind out of the sail. Because I don't think we spend enough time on the counter narrative and telling the success stories of folks who, as I said at the very beginning, have literally transformed a community by virtue of their presence. And I think there's a way in which marginalized folks sometimes internalize a kind of, I'll call it false humility around what can be articulated, what can we boast of, what can I name that I'm really proud of. And I think Amherst students increasingly are finding themselves emboldened, right, around talking about their contributions to communities. And it's on us to tell those stories more, but I also want students to sort of take those imperatives out into the world and learn how to talk about that in the workplace, in their communities, so that the narrative does begin to shift a little more.
I would just add that I think that, again, playing the old fart here, as I look at the world of African Americans around the time I entered college and what folks had accomplished in the realms where we had accomplished wonderful things compared to today, the transformation is astounding, bordering on exponential. The spheres where minorities operate today compared to 50, 60 years ago, particularly before Brown v. Board of Education, the ascent in the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, the education sectors has been astonishing. We do live in a market-oriented, highly competitive society. So one of the tough realities to come to terms with is that most structures take the form of trees, and as you climb the top, there's less and less room up at the top, regardless of what race you are, regardless of what academic preparation you have, and in some respects, regardless of what you've achieved. So people fall off the tree, and they've got to learn how to adapt, how to be alert to what level of ascent on the tree they're at risk. And I'll just give you a quick example. I was blessed to serve on several corporate boards, and I was astonished to discover how highly accomplished corporate executives of every race and predominantly white were at risk once they reached the age of 50 and were navigated out of the company, even though they were performing at peak level, because they weren't going to go all the way to the top. And at that age, they were considered blockers, because the institution had to provide opportunity for the 30 and 40-year-olds to climb, or else they'd lose them. And so the reason you never read about any age discrimination lawsuits is because in the private sector they get paid so much money to disappear. But I mean, I came from the nonprofit world. We don't have the resources to do that. But I just watched this pattern and I said, these folks are performing at peak. So they have to be alert to that and know it's coming, or It's another reason why this generation needs to be ever more entrepreneurial, because in addition to what I just described about the tree structure of the opportunity structure, the fact is the changes in the economy have pulled the rug out from under a lot of people. And so a lot of people are finding themselves at risk at a younger age as companies reorganize, blah, blah, blah. So that's what's going on generically without even getting into issues of race. And so young people have to be attuned to that, prepared for it, and figure out to the best of their ability to navigate against it, even as the vigilant advocacy groups have to guard against all the forms of discrimination that will knock people off of their career path. It's a rough world out there. That's the way our society functions, and it may be that will change, and I hope it will change, but it's not changing right now, and young people have to be prepared for that. The other thing I'd say is that Amherst and all higher education is basically spring training for life, and this is a 4-year opportunity to get ready intellectually and academically for what awaits. And you hope that young people go out into positions of leadership in whatever fields they choose, whether it's activism or whatever. But even if they don't do that, you hope that they've got a finely tuned social conscience and the right kinds of values, and you're hoping that they will express those values. It may be that they will find opportunities to express them, even though they may be working full-time somewhere else in order to pay the rent, or they may have to go flat out in a career, and then when they throttle back a little bit, they may get much more engaged. That's all fine. You don't have to follow one pattern. It's interesting. There are many modes of leadership and many modes of activism, and not everybody is going to follow exactly the same path. But I think the opportunity to live together, to learn together, to grow together in an environment like this, relatively insulated from the distractions outside, is really a privilege. It is really a privilege, and I hope students will take maximum advantage of that. And apropos of that, let me just add, I hope that they will be as open to listening to folks who have very different views than they do. Last night I went to a remarkable presentation by Nadine Strossen, who is the former CEO of the ACLU, and she's just written a book called Hate, and how the best antidote for hate is not censorship, it's the respect and defense of free speech. And I actually would urge the college to bring her to campus, because speech was given at Columbia Law School, very thought-provoking examination of these issues by one of the country's leading civil libertarians. He said the worst thing you can do is to try to stifle speech, unless it poses an immediate physical threat to people. But we've got to learn to listen, argue, debate, fight back, and overwhelm opposition with free speech rather than with censorship. Because as she found in her examination, invariably those measures turn on people who are turned against people who are most objecting to the kind of speech that we find problematic. So I hope that the environment will be as welcoming not welcoming, but as tolerant of different views of the world and different attitudes, so that we can learn from them and examine them.
Thank you. We have a few moments for questions from the group. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask the panelists? Yes, way in the back.
Hi, I'm Lily Johnson. I'm a senior here. And so I was interested to hear about your class, about talking about how you deal with like family members or people you know voting for Trump, and like cutting that out. And I was wondering the response, because I personally feel that Amherst and like the teachers don't recognize how many students here voted for Donald Trump and share a lot of those views. And while we have had a lot of progress, only half of the students were here when we had the uprising, and kind of how, because just kind of a story that I wanted to share was like, it really depends on what class you're in. And so I've had conversations with professors who teach, like I was having a conversation with my swags professor who was like, oh, I assumed no students here would have voted for Trump because he predominantly interacts with women or students of color, and then those who teach other sorts of classes who have a very different student body. So just kind of how the college will grapples with that, and how you prepare students to be respecting your peers, but in a space where people can feel unsafe to one degree, and also listening, but really not wanting to give in to some of those views. I'm sorry, I didn't articulate myself great.
No, you did. I mean, I'll say one thing, we didn't have anyone in the class who voted for Trump, but that may be because they self-select into the class, and maybe those people, I don't know, didn't feel safe, or whatever in terms of choosing this class. So it doesn't surprise me at all that there's students here who voted for Trump. I mean, there were young Republicans in the class,
It
but
surprised me, personally. But after my first year, I was
but I think it's harder for them to speak up. So you might not know how many students in your class voted for Trump. Maybe there was somebody who secretly did, but I don't think.
I bet there were. I'm
Maybe
betting
there
there were
were.
at least 2, maybe 3 in our class who voted for Trump. Yeah, I had a slightly different take on it, because I thought there were a couple of students who they themselves were members of the Amherst Republican
Yes.
Club, absolutely, but who also sort of talked about, and maybe it's a safer way to talk about voting for Trump when you can project it onto somebody else. When there were students who I thought that was really their own voice speaking through their concerns of their fathers or parents or uncles. But I think you're absolutely right that both. And following on Hugh's point too, is that, but it's critical, right, to our full development as a campus and as a culture, to be able to hear those voices, to respond to those, and respect them enough to be able to articulate an argument that refutes it, I think. That was, and the benefit of being able to being in a class where students had confessed that if this were a conversation in the dining hall at Valentine, if they heard somebody say they'd voted for Trump, easy to dismiss, walk away, write that person off, never going to deal with them again. Where we were able to create an environment where there was more engagement and progress and understanding to various degrees, because it was a more captive audience and there was less opportunity to escape, to flee.
Could I ask this question, and perhaps it's because I'm not on campus and I'm fresh off of this discussion of civil liberties last night. When you use the term unsafe, what do you mean by that? Do you mean physically unsafe or intellectually unsafe or uncomfortable, or what does that mean?
So I think a lot of times that in the college setting it can be when people feel uncomfortable, but I'm thinking of getting a call from a first year that I knew right after the election, who was a woman of color, people were chanting Trump outside her window, and like that sort of feeling. So I'm thinking of that, and then I'm also thinking of the discomfort of feeling not comfortable to speak up in a situation because you are in a group of people where you're like, I don't want to know if they're a Trump supporter, because I will think that they respect me less, either as a person of color or as a woman, or things like that.
Yeah, I think the word, Ellen, you used the word environment, and for me, that's kind of the key element, that there are those who are responsible for being very intentional about how you shape an environment such that those notions of safety are there. And so I'm not a big fan of sort of dialoguing across difference or reaching across the aisle or whatever the cliche might be, simply for the sake of doing it, but more so to sort of think about what is the end product? Why is it that we need to kind of situate our differences and have a discussion or a debate about it? And I think we have to be much more sort of critical and intentional about why that's important and the environments in which those conversations take place. Because, a residential situation where, I'm just sort of trying to chill out in my room at the end of the night and I might hear some chanting, that's very different perhaps than an academic environment where you're actually trying to teach specific skills around the ability to hear, the ability to listen actively and respond. So I think sometimes we sort of fail to complicate what it is we're talking about and what the end goal really is in terms of the learning.
But I'll just say one thing. One skill that students left our course with was the skill of dialoguing, of, listening actively for understanding, because some of these students did go home and talk to their families. And one young woman was able, for the first time since the election, to talk with her brother and to understand more how his growing up was a little different than hers and why he might have come to the decisions that he came to. And, and the other Asian woman went home and talked to her father, So, I mean, they had the skills which they said before the course, these conversations would have gone very badly.
Interesting.
But now it was possible to have the conversation. Because people coming into this course said a lot of times if they try to talk about these issues, not just about Trump, about issues where there really are differences, it goes very badly. And so either they don't do it, or they end up going separate ways afterwards. So they do need skills, understandings to be able to have the conversations.
Thank you. Had some.
Yes, a question here.
Mr. Price, I'm wondering, as you look at the country, the Census Bureau earlier in this young century said that America would become a majority-minority country by 2043. The recession actually had families having fewer babies, so they moved it to 2044-45. If the proposals about how to change the immigration laws become law, it may become 2050. When you think about Charlottesville and men marching around a statue of a Confederate general chanting, "You will not replace us," do you think Americans have underestimated the anxiety that will accompany that transition to a majority-minority country?
Well, I certainly think that Trump has given voice to it, and anxiety is putting it kindly about what he's doing. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he is spearheading an effort to reverse what we thought were inexorable demographic trends. I have no illusions about what he's up to. Move Latinos out of this country, cut off immigration from predominantly black. I mean, the demographics. I'm not aware of any immigrants from what might be considered Caucasian countries who
Well, he was hoping for Norway.
I know. Are you Ray Suarez by any chance? I thought so. Everybody knows who Ray Suarez is, right? Great journalist. This is the first time we've met. So I think that's going, but I mean, that's what's going on all over Europe as well, Western Europe. I mean, that's what's behind Hungary and Czech Republic, et cetera. So there's kind of, there's an effort to unlearn what we've learned about the virtues of diversity, the power of it. It's interesting, the Republicans from densely populated eastern states believe passionately in immigration. I mean, the most passionate person on this subject may be Rudy Giuliani, or not most other things that would affect minorities, but that's not what Trump is about. So I think the agenda is really pernicious, this is one of the many reasons why the conversation we've got to lower the decibel level where we can and have dialogues more locally. I mean, I wish the religious community were much more deeply involved in this. I write in my memoir, when I was growing up in the Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C., our Sunday school, which is an integrated church, our Sunday school class visited a Sunday school class from a different denomination every month, and vice versa. And the learning that occurred across religious lines, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, Greek Orthodox, was astounding, to the point that you sort of came out of that experience really not having ethnic difference on the frontal lobe. So I think the religious community has got to step back into the breach. I think schools have got to do this. And somehow institutions like Amherst and all schools like it, we've got to build these bridges of understanding. And also the transformation in attitudes won't necessarily occur overnight if people have a different worldview. One, it's important to listen and understand, well, what's the source of your anxiety? Who do you fear and why? And to what extent do the folks you fear have anything to do with your circumstances that caused so much dismay. That's what's been fascinating to me, to read these books about the anxiety, or to see Lynn Nottage's amazing play called Sweat, which is about factory workers in a small Pennsylvania town whose factory has moved out, and they're blaming everybody except for the executives of the company that blew the market share. And that's the story of Janesville. General Motors blows the market share it had in automobile manufacturing, and everybody's blaming everybody but General Motors for the consolidation. So I think that's part of the, you put your finger on one of the big battles, not just in this country, and but also abroad, and why we need to go at this. When I headed the league, relations between blacks and Jews were at their nadir, 1994, you probably remember. And I'm proud to say I became one of the first African-American leaders to stand up in a major national speech and said, we've got to cut it out, and implicitly critical of Farrakhan. And I just said, we allies who used to be so close, may disagree about affirmative action, but we're on the same page about everything else, have got to recommit to collaboration, and we've got to understand what our differences are. And it's hard to do that on talk shows. It's hard to do that in the newspapers. We've got to go back. So we went back to the fundamentals of small meetings, leadership meetings, constituent meetings in communities all across the country, which is the Urban League is masterful at, building race relations on the ground, finding areas to collaborate, finding areas for understanding, and agreeing that while we may strongly disagree about affirmative action, we're not calling anybody any names about that, but we may align around other issues. One of our most staunch supporters in our battles to fight police brutality and racial profiling to get President Clinton to pay attention to this issue was the Anti-Defamation League. And having them lockstep with us on that was huge, because it made the statement that this isn't just a black issue, this is a human rights issue that affects everyone. So I'm glad you raised the question, and I think that's the hard work of building understanding, developing knowledge and tolerance toward the views of others, and then going about the arduous work of trying to help people see what the common stake is. We've got things going on a lot of different levels. There are some issues that are just holy wars. There's no right or wrong. LBGT rights, minority rights under the Constitution. Those are things that you can't compromise about that. But there are a lot of issues where there are zones of compromise, and where there's also a recognition that this won't happen overnight, but we've got to go to work on it together. And if we don't figure out how to reduce the number of holy wars and find compromise, this country is going to come apart at the seams. And the last time, again, the advantage of being older is the United States in the 1960s, when King and Kennedy were assassinated in the same year, and the anti-Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and the riots and the women's movement, it was a very turbulent time. And it wasn't abundantly clear that the American experience was going to work back then. It was not. The National Guard troops shot student protesters at Kent State. I mean, it was not abundantly clear whether the country would find its way through the turbulence it was dealing with then. It is not abundantly clear whether the United States, particularly if Trump does something really dumb about the special counsel, is going to find its way through this. And people who believe in the core values of this country and understand them and are deeply committed to them are going to have to step forward. And so, I mean, you set me off on a lot of points, but these are very unnerving times, and it takes institutions like this one to equip young people to understand, to persuade, to build consensus, and to keep the fabric of the country stitched together, keep Humpty Dumpty from cracking up.
I think on that note, I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, so let me quickly say that. I'm Alan Hart. I'm a professor in the psychology department and a member of the class of 1982. Please join me in thanking Norm Jones, Professor Buffy Aries, and Hugh Price.
Thank you.